morning, everyone. Hey, and just on the note of Sarah being up here, I read something that I think will probably always stick with me during vacation 2 weeks ago. I was on a train from DC to Boston. It was like an 8-hour train ride. So I read an entire book. And what it said is that the church should be the locus of leadership development. And so that's something that's just kind of stayed with me. So I love having Sarah here because I think some of us may hear the word intern and maybe plug in some tapes of just doing like little stuff, and that's actually not what Sarah's going to be doing, because one of the things that we believe in here at New Life is that this is going to be a church now that raises up and develops leaders and sends them out. So I just want you to hear that and know that that's the values of ours, and we are so glad that Sarah is here. So anyways, on that, this is our last Sunday in this I Am series, and here's the question that I want us to start off with this morning. It's really simple. Do you want to be a great person? Another way of asking it is, how can you be a great person? How can you live a life that's fruitful, that's impactful, and that's full of great character? I think that's probably a question that cultures of all times and of all places have asked in some shape or form, although it may look slightly different. And especially now, I think, in our society, I'm not sure if I can think of a more relevant question that tries to figure out, how does someone go from being hateful to loving, right? How does someone go from being divisive to peaceful? How does someone go from being unjust to just? And we can plug in every other character trait in there. So how do you become a great person? And it's fascinating to me, as a pastor, I feel like I constantly hear or read people say, you know what, morality and character is just going down the drain in our society. And what's interesting to me is that especially after this crazy election that just happened a couple weeks ago, I think we probably all agree, whatever side of the spectrum you're on, that's for you, is that there was one huge point of contention. And the reason why the election was so volatile and it was so unique, I can't remember a thing in my lifetime that's caused so much rhetoric, was that both sides attacked each other's character, right? So Democrats attacked Trump for, saying he's racist, doesn't treat women correctly, and the other way, right? I'm not making a political stance here this morning, that Republicans then usually attacked Hillary, saying she's not trustworthy because of the whole email thing. And I'm not getting into politics. All I'm saying, my point is this, that what that shows me is that our country still actually really cares about character. Whatever side you're on, right? We still kill about, we don't kill, we still care. Wow, that did not make sense. That was not a Freudian slip. We still care about not killing people. So people's lives, their actions, their fruit, how impactful are you? Those are questions that matter today. And it's actually not even just in politics. You see it in the business world. So there's a really popular, New York Times best-selling book called Good to Great. And if you're a business person, if you're into leadership, you've probably read it. It's by a guy named Jim Collins, I think. Yes. And what he talks about in Good to Great is how companies make this dramatic turnaround, how they go into sustaining profits long term. And really what he says is that that's actually all due to what's called a level 5 leader. And so you probably ask, okay, well, what are the traits of a level 5 leader? According to his research team, it was remarkable modesty and humility of these leaders that turned these companies around. And so words like quiet, humble, modest, gracious, and a slew of all other words were used to describe these leaders that made this dramatic turnaround in these companies. And so I bring this up, politics and business, two things that you're not supposed to talk about on stage, to say this: we still care about character, right? All of us want to live fruitful lives. The problem is we have a hard time actually doing that. Same case with Israel in the Old Testament. So Israel, before Jesus, well, actually, so after Jesus as well, but the church in the Old Testament, so to speak, God wanted them to live lives that were fruitful. And so there's this metaphor that's scattered all throughout the Old Testament, and Israel's called a vine. They're called a vineyard. And the reason why they were called that is not to literally produce fruit, but to produce fruit of good character. And so I just want to read this for us, a passage. Don't worry about turning there. And what we're going to see is that the problem with Israel being a vine or a vineyard is that they didn't live up to their calling. They didn't actually produce good fruit. So the ancient prophet Isaiah in chapter 5, this is what he writes, and we'll put it on the screen here. Speaking of God, my loved one had a vineyard on a fertile hillside. And God, he looked for a crop of good grapes, but it yielded only bad fruit. Now I will tell you what I'm going to do to my vineyard. I will make it a wasteland. And remember this, neither pruned nor cultivated. And briars and thorns will grow there. And here's the sentence. The vineyard of the Lord Almighty is the nation of Israel. And the people of Judah are the vines he delighted in. And he looked for justice, but saw bloodshed. He looked for righteousness, but he heard cries of distress. So Israel's the vine, and they've produced a lot of bad fruit. And so Israel, too, thousands of years ago, was a part of this cultural conversation about how can you live a life of great character? How can you be fruitful? How can you be impactful with your actions? And so what's interesting is that throughout the Old Testament, whenever this metaphor is used of Israel, it's usually always used in a context of God judging Israel. Because Israel did not live up to their calling to be fruitful because of their sin and their shortcomings. Insert Jesus. So we're going to turn to the biography of John for the last time in this series. It's going to be John chapter 15. It'll be on page 752 in these free gray Bibles that are underneath the chairs in front of you. And is it just me, or is it crazy that next week starts like the Christmas season? Like, that just blows me away. So, John chapter 15, verse 1, Jesus doesn't waste any time as he usually doesn't. He says this, I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. So we're just going to stop right there, because this could be a whole sermon, just the words true vine. So kind of maybe as you're guessing, what Jesus is getting at is that he's the true vine. What Israel should have done, but they couldn't, now Jesus is doing that. He's producing the good fruit that Israel couldn't, like the Whole Foods, organic, expensive kind, okay? If you shop at Whole Foods, you know what I'm talking about. Jesus is all about going organic. This is good news. This is gospel. And I'll tell you why this is good news and this is gospel. And that's because all of us here have a little bit of Israel in us. What do I mean? All of us here, if we're honest, let's pull off the religious mask. We've all produced some pretty bad, rotten fruit. I don't know about you guys, I love bananas, right? One of the things that disappoints me the most is when I see a nice yellow ripe banana and then I unpeel it and it's got a bunch of brown spots. Even worse with avocados. That's us. You might look ripe on the outside, but a lot of us are rotten on the inside. Jesus is what we cannot be. He has done what we cannot do. That's what he's saying by saying, I am the true vine. And I love what Matt Chandler, he's a pastor in Dallas, he says this, Jesus as the true vine, here's what he does. He enters into like our banner of failure, and he says, I got you. I got you. I know you don't have the good fruit, but I do. And I'm going to let you partake in that. So that's good news. That's awesome, right? Don's shaking his head. That's what I'm talking about. You're awake this morning. The very next words, Jesus starts talking about pruning, like cutting off branches. So things take a little bit of a turn here. The good thing, though, is that probably the best thing for us actually is to be pruned. And so Jesus continues. Let's hop back in. Verse 2. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit. Okay. While every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes so that it'll be even more fruitful. You are already clean because of the word I have spoken to you. And just so you know, the word clean there, it means like morally pure. But Jesus is actually doing a play on words here because in the Greek, the word clean also carries agricultural connotations that mean pruned. So kind of what he's saying is, hey, you believe in my words of life, my story of redemption, the gospel, and because of that, you've already been pruned. But he continues. So he says, remain in me. Some translations will say, abide in me, as I also remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. And neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. I am the vine, and you are the branches. And if you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit, because apart from me, you can do nothing. If you do not remain in me, you are a branch that is thrown away and withers, and such branches are picked up, thrown into the fire, and burned. Welcome to church. If you remain in me and my words remain in you, ask whatever you wish and it'll be done for you. That does not mean that you can pray for a Ferrari and that tomorrow morning it shows up on your driveway, okay? God's not a magical genie. What he's getting at here is that if you are staying connected to Jesus, like if you're listening to his words, you're a follower of him, chances are you're probably praying for things that are a part of his agenda and his heart. I mean, isn't it interesting that actually our prayers are usually reflections of what our true desires are? And that can be good or bad. All of this, verse 8, is to my Father's glory, that you bear much fruit, showing yourselves to be my disciples. And if we skip down to verse 11, what's the whole point of this? I've told you this so that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be made complete. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't know much about gardening. So in the last year or so, my wife Rachel has kind of gotten into it, and our backyard has like experienced a transformation. It's awesome. So I picked up some things here and there from Rachel about gardening. But I don't know anything about vines and pruning. And they say in education that the best way to learn is to actually experience something, not just to like learn about it abstractly. And so actually this past week, I actually went up to Napa Valley, a little 2-day retreat, had some wine, looked at some grapes. I'm joking. Who here thought I was being serious? Man, okay. Maybe I should have done that. I don't know. Who knows? Anyway, here's the point. It's actually really simple about pruning and vines, okay? And the same thing is true of actually rose bushes. Pruning, all pruning is strategically cutting off a branch with the intention or with the desire that it actually makes the plant better, right? You're cutting off a branch so that it actually produces better fruit. And so branches that are growing like inwardly or that are in this tangled mess are actually cut off so that branches can grow outward facing the sunlight, okay? The other part of this is, well, they need help growing in the right direction and towards the right end. And so a gardener, he or she prunes branches so that they're no longer wasting energy on unproductive branches that are not bearing really high quality fruit. I love what one scholar put. He put this: you prune the rose to help it to be its true self. Left to themselves, they produce a lot of non-productive growth, which must be cut away if the vine is truly to be what it's capable of. You prune a rose to help it be its true self. Now, the other component of this whole gardening metaphor thing that Jesus uses here is far more obvious, and I think we all know it, and it's this. If you cut off a branch, like from a vine or from a tree, if you cut off a branch from a tree, what happens? It's no longer connected to its root system, its stem, meaning it's not going to get any more water, it's not going to get any more nutrients, it's going to die, and it's probably going to die pretty soon, right? We know that part. So here's what Jesus is saying to kind of just summarize this metaphor here. Jesus is saying that he's the vine and all of us here are the branches. And of course, the point of any plant is to grow and to produce fruit. And so the way that we as humans, as followers of this Jesus, the way that we grow, the way that we flourish, the way that we become fully alive is actually by staying connected to the vine, Jesus. And at the same time, allowing the gardener, God, to prune us. I just said a lot right there, so let me say it again. Us as followers of Jesus, the way that we grow, the way that we flourish, and just an abundant fruit and become fully alive is by staying connected to Jesus, who's the vine, and allowing God the Father, the gardener, to prune us. Now, it's almost Christmas time, so literally right on the corner of my house where I live, they just put up one of those temporary Christmas tree farm things, where you can go out and buy Christmas trees. And so this, at least for me, raises the common question that every family faces, I think, or they argue with other families. And it's this: do you buy a real Christmas tree or do you buy a fake Christmas tree? So we're going to do a quick survey this morning. There's no shame here. This is a safe place, okay? Who here still buys a real Christmas tree? Raise your hand. Wow, actually less than I thought. We got a lot of fakes here. So raise your hand proudly if you buy a fake tree. Wow, we are proud about that. Come on now. That's what I'm talking about. So I was a part of a family growing up that every year we bought a real Christmas tree, okay? I could probably share a lot of stories here that might be interesting about those adventures. But I was the person in my family usually every morning, like 6 a.m. or something before school, where I had to get underneath the tree, pull the branches up, and put the water into the pot thing there at the bottom that's attached to the stem. Now, I always thought, why are we even doing this? Because we all know what happens in 3 to 4 weeks. The thing dies. I mean, it's on its way to dying, actually, by the time right when it gets cut off. And so what happens, right? All the needles turn brown and yellow, and it gets more crunchy, and I know that sounds weird. And then the needles fall all on the ground, and if you have a dog and the dog messes with them, it's a mess, okay? And so it doesn't matter what you do to that tree, right? You can put all your Hallmark ornaments on it. And my family, my sister and I, we always got a new one each year representing the boy in the family and the girl in the family. You put all, the nice, gorgeous lights on the tree. You're either a family that does all white lights or you do the colorful lights, okay? And that's even a debate in and of itself. You can do all that. But what happens in just a couple weeks? The Christmas tree goes downhill. It's been cut off from its original root system where it receives all its nutrients. And so Rachel and I made the proud decision last year, we got our first fake tree. Thank you, Target. I get some clapping for that. That's awesome. I'll be honest, the real reason why we did it, we want to save money, we want to be able to store the thing. So I kind of sound like a Grinch this morning or something. I don't know. I'm not. I love Christmas. But as I was studying this passage this past week, I think that's what actually a lot of us do in our desire to be a great person, right? The great character, high impactful lives, full of fruit. And we think that by putting all these external ornaments and decorations on our tree, our life in this case, that we can just make it beautiful and healthy and growing. And let's just get to the real this morning. If you're cut off from the stem, it doesn't matter what you put on that tree. You're not going to survive. And so there are countless ornaments, if you will, to keep this metaphor going. I'm going to call them external things that vie for your attention and say, hey, use this, put this on, because it'll make you great, or it's going to help you change. And so how many, like books and commercials, I call it self-help advice, do we see that, you can break your addiction, or you can get rid of this negative personality trait of yourself. You can turn yourself into this joyful, loving person. I mean, I see stuff like that all over the place, especially when you go into a bookstore. Also, I think the church is really good at this too. I'd be willing to bet that if you surveyed most people in America and asked them describe a Christian, or what do you think it means to follow Jesus, I'd be willing to bet you that the majority would say, oh yeah, it's just about being a good person, right? I mean, just go do a bunch of good things, which means what? You got to obey rules and commands and laws. So we turn Jesus, we kind of end up being just a bunch of moral legalists. And let me be clear, laws, rules, and morals are important. Not saying don't do those things. But that becomes the focus. Here's some others. Tim Keller, a pastor in New York who's influenced me greatly in this sermon, he says, hey, there's actually two other external things that we also do to help us change to become a great person. And he says it's fear and pride. Here's what he means by fear. How many stories have you heard? Marriage is the classic example, but it doesn't have to be in marriage, where one spouse tells the other, if you don't change, I'm out. If you don't stop behaving this way and start behaving this way, I'm going to leave you. And so what happens? Well, the spouse that was told that, yeah, they'll change for a couple days, a couple weeks, a couple months, maybe even a couple years. But from a pastoral counseling sense, I've heard so many stories where then that person reverts back to what they tried to change. Fear will bring you short-term results, but not long-term sustainable harvest. We can say the same thing for pride. The point is this: are we just going to put a bunch of Christmas tree ornaments and lights on ourselves? Because the ornaments of self-help advice, the ornaments of just following rules and being a good moral person, the ornaments of fear and pride, that will give you short-term fruit, but not a lasting harvest. And so Jesus is telling us this morning that external forces, that's actually not what's going to bring you fruit. It's only organic connection. The way to grow, again, do you want to be a great person? A life of fruit, of impact? Then remain in Jesus, the true vine. Elsewhere in the New Testament, another letter, we hear of this thing called the fruit of the Spirit, right? And so I think a question for us this morning is, do you want your life to be characterized by, do you want to be a person that experiences love and joy and peace and patience and goodness and kindness and self-control? I'm not sure if I got them all in there. And I think our culture at large, we celebrate those things. Those are good things. Everyone wants those, except for maybe self-control. The key is Jesus. It's not what you do, because Jesus has already done everything for you. He's divine. It's not trying to, externally change your moral behavior. I love this quote that I heard this past week. Listen to this. Jesus says, he doesn't say, clean up and then come to me. He actually says, come to me and I'll clean you up. Come to me and I'll clean you up. So again, let's hear these words again. I want them just to kind of marinate in this morning, starting in verse 4. Remain in me as I remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. And neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. I'm the vine, we are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. That is a promise. And it's also a promise that apart from me, you can do nothing. Because if you don't remain in Jesus, you're like a branch that is thrown away and withers, and such branches are picked up, thrown into the fire, and burned. All to the Father's glory, that you bear much fruit, proving yourself to be a follower of him. I had to ask myself a really tough question this week. It was just this, Mark, am I bearing fruit? Am I bearing fruit? And honestly, I'm not sure how much I have been. Because bearing fruit, what that looks like, my neighbors, am I helping out those in need? Is my marriage as strong as it could be? Am I listening to, much less helping, those in our society who feel marginalized? I mean, just to be honest, am I even growing? I think so. I think most of us just have to start there. Are you flourishing as a human being? See, the American church has turned Christianity into this thing where, being a Christian is just all about getting this out-of-hell insurance card. Right? We turn Christianity into hey, it's just a one-time thing where you check a box, you say a prayer, and you're in. That's not what following Jesus is. Now, those things matter. Let me be clear on that. But following Jesus means that you are abiding in him. You are connected to him organically and intimately. And so what does that look like? How do you stay connected to Jesus? Right? You abide in him. You remain in him by praying. You abide in him not just by reading the Bible, but actually meditating and reflecting on it and allowing it to change you. You remain in Jesus by worshiping him. You remain in Jesus actually by giving back to God what he first gave you. By being in a life group, by being in community and talking to others about following Jesus. By serving. If we were to go further on in this chapter, really, it's just by loving people. So, I'm asking myself, am I organically connected to Jesus? In verses 14 through 16, he says actually something pretty shocking. He calls his disciples friends. Not servants, but friends. That doesn't seem shocking to us because we got a bunch of songs that call Jesus our friend. It was in that context. Is Jesus your friend? And what I don't mean by that is the type of friend that, you call up when you go out and travel to the East Coast, you need a place to stay, and so you awkwardly call them one time a year to ask them to stay there. Oh yeah, that's my friend. I did that a couple weeks ago. Not the friendship Jesus is talking about. Friendship, like, are you spending time with Jesus the way that you do with your best friend? And you talk to him, and you spend time with him, and you grieve with him, and you celebrate with him. I remember I said that kind of the whole point of this metaphor is that we as humans, as followers of this Jesus, the way that we bear fruit, the way we grow is by staying connected to him, being intimately involved with him. And the second half of that was allowing God the gardener to prune you. Now this one's a little bit more hard, but I think we actually all know this from experience. When in your life have you learned the most, right? When have you been the most shaped and formed? When has your character been refined the most? Usually, that happens in the most difficult times. For me, one of the most difficult and painful, literally, times of my life was about 5-6 years ago. And I had these crazy neurological symptoms. I mean, I had like pulsating headaches, tingling in my arms, couldn't sleep, had crazy vision problems, dizziness if I didn't say that. And so I went to all these doctors, did all these MRIs, did all these tests. I found out real quick what health insurance is like in America too. That's a different topic. And they didn't end up finding anything. And from what we now know, at least from the doctors think, from what I think, from what my family thinks, actually, all those things were actually probably just caused from stress and anxiety. And there's a lot of people who struggle with anxiety in here. And I don't necessarily bring that up to talk about anxiety as much as I bring that up to point out the fact that as I look back on that time of my life, that left deep, lasting change on me because God was pruning me. And you know what he was pruning? He cut off the branches of anxiety and he cut off the branches of control. Because I'm a person, I love to be in control. I'm a very driven, ambitious person, and I like to write my own destiny. And if you live life long enough, you know that you can't do that. And I had to learn that the hard way. I also want to be very careful and sensitive here. When we talk about pruning, it's not as though, God is kind of looking down on you and intentionally putting you in these evil situations full of suffering and heartbreak, and he's just kind of sitting back like laughing at you. No, that's not the God that we see in Jesus. So I want to be really clear on that. The issue is actually more that we live in a broken world. And so it is inevitable that at some point in our lives, if you haven't experienced it already, multiple times, so to speak, the knife will come to cut off branches. And that's just a part of living in what I call a jacked up world. And so Jesus is in the business of actually restoring and redeeming and fixing that. Amen. But it is inevitable, because we live in this broken world, that there will be times when the knife comes. And so Jesus is saying, if you're remaining, if you're abiding in him, if you're staying connected to him during these bad situations, as Keller says, these bad situations, they actually won't make you hard, they'll make you soft. These bad situations, if you're connected to Jesus, they won't make you dumb, they'll actually make you wise. If you're connected and remaining in Jesus during these bad times, you won't become less human, you'll become more human. These bad times will actually make you a great person. But if you're not connected to Jesus, when this stuff happens, you'll probably be cut off. Because you're probably going to turn into an angry person, a critical person, a hopeless person, a selfish person. The point of being pruned is so that you're forced to get life from the vine. The point of being pruned is that you're forced to get life from the vine. C.S. Lewis, brilliant, extremely insightful guy. Used to be an atheist, became a Christian. He has a quote that I want us to look at. He can say things so much better than I'll ever be able to. Here's what C.S. Lewis says. That is why we must not be surprised if we are in for a rough time. When a man turns to Christ and seems to be getting on pretty well, in the sense that some of his bad habits are now corrected, he often feels that it would now be natural if things went fairly smoothly. When troubles come along, illnesses, money troubles, new kinds of temptation, he is disappointed. These things, he feels, might have been necessary to rouse him and make him repent in his battle days. But why now? Because God is forcing him on or up to a higher level, putting him into situations where he'll have to be much braver or more patient or more loving than he ever dreamed of being before. It seems to us all unnecessary. Man, I love this. But that is because we have not yet had the slightest notion of the tremendous thing he means to make of us. We don't have the slightest notion of the high quality grapes that he wants to come from our vine. So a question for us this morning. Are you allowing God to prune you? Are you allowing God to cut off those unhealthy branches that are actually preventing you from becoming a beautiful and flourishing human who's fully alive? Is the pruning leading you to go back to the vine or to be cut off? And remember, God actually does this for your joy, so that your joy may be made complete. There is a difference between joy and happiness. Happiness is fickle, okay? Happiness depends upon the day, whether you have a good hair day or a bad hair day, whether the stock market has done well or bad for you, how your latte was made. That's happiness. Joy is so much stronger. Joy is mature. Joy is through like the thick and thin of things. Joy is beautiful. And so as we end this morning, isn't it fascinating that the scriptures start in a garden full of fruit? And most of us know the story, right? Our ancestors, they were cut off from the garden because they thought they could get life a different way. The good news, the gospel, is that Jesus, the true vine, Jesus was cut off on the cross so that you would not be cut off. And we desire and crave fruitful, impactful lives of great character. And in the midst of our failure and rotten fruit, Jesus says, I'm the vine. It's through me that you'll get good fruit. Just stay in me. Be organically connected to me. And so I'm going to invite the worship team back up. And we're going to head into our time of response. One of the things that we value here at New Life is we're not people who just sit in chairs and hear something and that's it. All right, that's religion. We believe that our God is in the business of changing and transforming us, and we respond to that invitation. And so I don't know where you're at this morning. I think for some of us, a question is, is there evidence of fruit in your life? I mean, are you spending time with Jesus, like intimately, so that you can bear fruit? Others of us, we actually may be in a season of pruning. And if that's you, I think a question to ask is, what is God up to in that? Like what is he pruning? What is he cutting off? Who is the person that he's making you into? And so we have communion here this morning that you can take to be reminded that, Jesus was actually cut off on the cross so that you wouldn't be. We have candles over here that you can light to signify the hope that is in Jesus. We have a prayer team back there who would love to pray for you about anything. And this morning, because it's Thanksgiving week, we actually have our special Thanksgiving offering. And so all the funds that we receive that are over our normal budget, all of them will go to painting the stairwells and to recarpeting the youth room, because we love our students and they deserve to have the best stuff. And so that's our Thanksgiving offering this morning. So we just ask that you just play a part in that. And if you're new here, there's no obligation. So I just invite the ushers forward now to collect the offering. Feel free to stand, feel free to sit, to visit one of the stations. Let's just have the Holy Spirit move.